In the year 858, a remarkable and unusual man was elevated to the patriarchal throne of Constantinople. His name was Photius. He was not, as one might expect, a long-serving bishop who had risen slowly through the ranks of the Eastern Church. He was a layman, a scholar, the most brilliant intellectual in the Byzantine Empire of his generation, a man of imperial connections who had served as the chief secretary of state for the Byzantine government. Within just 6 days, he was rushed through every ecclesiastical order from layman to patriarch, an extraordinary and irregular elevation that would never have happened in normal times. But these were not normal times. The previous patriarch, Ignatius, had just been deposed by the Byzantine Emperor Michael III under highly controversial circumstances. The Eastern Church was deeply divided, and the new patriarch Photius was about to find himself at the center of the first serious, open, personal confrontation between the See of Rome and the See of Constantinople in the entire history of the Church. The Pope in Rome at this same moment was an equally formidable figure. His name was Nicholas I, and history would call him Nicholas the Great. He was perhaps the most assertive and self-conscious advocate of papal authority that the medieval West had yet produced. 2 strong men, 2 great sees, a disputed election, and a long history of underlying tensions waiting for a trigger. Today, in Episode 5 of our series on the Great Schism, we are going to look at the confrontation between Photius and Nicholas in the 860s, the first real break. To understand what happened, we need to understand how Photius came to be patriarch in the first place. The previous patriarch, Ignatius, was a man of holy reputation, but also of fierce political enemies. He had publicly refused communion to the emperor's uncle Bardas on grounds of scandal in his personal life. The emperor Michael III and his powerful uncle responded by forcing Ignatius to resign from the patriarchal throne. Ignatius later said his resignation had been extracted under duress. His supporters insisted he was still the rightful patriarch. The emperor and the imperial faction needed a new patriarch who could give the deposition some appearance of legitimacy. They chose Photius. He was brilliant, well-connected, personally pious, and a complete outsider to the existing church hierarchy. The rapid ordination through every rank in 6 days was, in canonical terms, deeply irregular. Multiple Eastern bishops refused to accept the new patriarch. The Ignatian faction began appealing to other churches for support. Both sides, the Photians and the Ignatians, wrote to Rome asking the Pope to confirm their position. The dispute over who was the true Patriarch of Constantinople was now in the lap of Pope Nicholas I. Nicholas was exactly the kind of pope who would not let an opportunity like this slip away. He saw himself as the universal pastor of the whole Christian world. The dispute between 2 factions in Constantinople, both formally appealing to Rome, was for Nicholas a perfect demonstration of the universal jurisdiction of the See of Peter. He sent legates to Constantinople in 861 to investigate. The legates, after participating in a local Byzantine synod, declared in favor of Photius and against Ignatius. They returned to Rome. Nicholas was furious. He believed his legates had exceeded their authority by giving a final judgment on the spot. The case, in his view, was supposed to be decided by Rome after the legates reported back. In 863, Nicholas convened a Roman synod and reversed the decision of his own legates. He declared Photius deposed and Ignatius the rightful patriarch of Constantinople. He sent letters to that effect to Constantinople. He was, in other words, claiming unambiguous authority to to depose the Patriarch of one of the great Eastern sees by his own papal judgment, against the wishes of the Byzantine emperor and the local Byzantine synod that had elected Photius. This was a kind of papal intervention in Eastern affairs that no previous pope had attempted in quite this direct form, and the Eastern Church was not going to accept it quietly. The Bulgarian question turned the dispute from a procedural quarrel into a deeper crisis. In the early 860s, the Bulgarian king Boris had converted to Christianity. The question was, under whose ecclesiastical jurisdiction would the new Bulgarian Church fall? Constantinople and Rome both wanted Bulgaria in their own sphere. The Byzantine missions of Saint Cyril and Methodius were already at work in Slavic lands. The Bulgarian king Boris, playing both sides skillfully, briefly accepted Latin missionaries from Rome instead of Byzantine missionaries from Constantinople, in part because Rome offered more favorable terms on questions of liturgy and ecclesiastical autonomy. For Photius, this was an outrage. Bulgaria was geographically and culturally in the Byzantine orbit. The Latin missionaries arriving in Bulgaria were preaching a Latin Christianity with Latin liturgy and Latin theology, including the Filioque addition to the creed that the Byzantine East considered illegitimate. Photius now had not only a personal grievance against Rome over his own contested election, but a missionary grievance about Roman interference in what he considered Byzantine territory. And he had the theological grievance about the Filioque being preached on Byzantine borders. In 867, Photius struck back. He convened a council in Constantinople that did something unprecedented. The council formally condemned Pope Nicholas I. It declared the Filioque addition to the creed to be a heresy. It accused the Western Church of multiple theological errors, including the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the celibacy requirement for priests, fasting on Saturdays, and the Filioque. The council declared Pope Nicholas himself deposed and excommunicated. Let that sink in. The Patriarch of Constantinople and a Byzantine council had formally excommunicated and deposed the Pope of Rome. There had been heated disputes between East and West before. There had been mutual recriminations and dueling synods. But no patriarch had ever before formally pronounced excommunication against a sitting pope. The line had been crossed. Photius was claiming, in effect, that the Patriarch of Constantinople had the authority to judge and depose the Bishop of Rome, which was, of course, the exact mirror image of what Nicholas had been claiming about his own authority over Photius. Two men, two sees, two completely incompatible visions of authority, now both formally deploying that authority against each other. The drama then took an unexpected turn. The same year that Photius excommunicated Nicholas, 867, a palace coup in Constantinople changed everything. The Emperor Michael III was murdered by his close associate Basil, who took the throne for himself as Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Basil immediately deposed Photius and restored Ignatius to the patriarchal throne. The political winds in Constantinople had reversed. Photius retired into exile and scholarship. Pope Nicholas died that same year, 867, without having heard the news of his own excommunication. His successor, Pope Hadrian II, was eager to restore relations with the restored Eastern Church. A council was convened in Constantinople in 869 and 870, attended by papal legates, which condemned Photius, confirmed Ignatius as the legitimate patriarch, and was later counted by the Western Church as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. The whole crisis seemed to be over. The excommunications had been mutual, but the political conditions that produced them had passed. East and West were formally reconciled again, but the reconciliation was less stable than it appeared. When Ignatius died in 877, who became the next Patriarch of Constantinople? Photius. Yes, the same Photius who had been condemned and exiled was now recalled and elevated back to the patriarchal throne. And this time it happened with the explicit consent and even the request of the new pope, John VIII, who had succeeded Hadrian. A new council was convened in Constantinople in 879 and 880. This council, which the East counts as the true Eighth Ecumenical Council, formally reversed the previous condemnation of Photius. It restored him to the patriarchal throne with full legitimacy. It also issued formal statements about the integrity of the original Nicene Creed. Pope John VIII, present through his legates, accepted these decisions. Photius and Rome were formally reconciled. The West would later refuse to count this 879-880 council as ecumenical. The East counts it as one of the most important councils in church history. Already, even within a single generation, East and West could not agree on which councils mattered. When the dust settled, several lasting things had happened. First, the principle that the Pope could depose an Eastern patriarch had been openly asserted by Rome and openly rejected by the East. Second, the principle that the East could excommunicate the Pope had been openly asserted by Constantinople and openly rejected by the West. Both claims had been formally made and never formally withdrawn. The constitutional question of who had final authority in the universal church now had explicit historical precedents pointing in opposite directions. Third, Photius's catalogue of Western errors had become a kind of reference document that Eastern theologians would return to again and again in the centuries to come. The filioque, unleavened bread, mandatory celibacy, Saturday fasting, and other Western particulars had now been formally named as objections to the Latin tradition. Future Eastern critics of the West would inherit this list and expand it. Fourth, the pattern of the dispute, in which a procedural quarrel about church jurisdiction quickly metastasized into a theological denunciation of the other tradition's entire way of being Christian, had now been established. The dispute about Photius had not been mainly about Photius. It had been about whether East and West were even fully the same church anymore. So Photius and Nicholas are the first great personal embodiments of the schism that was now visibly forming. Both were holy and serious men in their own way. Photius, after his death, would be canonized as a saint in the Orthodox tradition. Nicholas would be commemorated as a great pope in the Catholic tradition. Each held positions about church authority that the other found genuinely intolerable. Each used the resources of his see, his theology, and his tradition to defend what he understood to be the apostolic faith. Each in his own context was right by his own standards, and each looked at the other and saw a man overstepping the limits set by the Holy Fathers. The Photian crisis of the 860s, even though it was formally resolved by 880, established the patterns and the precedents that would shape every subsequent confrontation between East and West. When the next great crisis came, in the 11th century, in the city of Constantinople in the summer of 1054, the actors would change, but the script was already written. That is the story we will turn to in the next episode of this series. The day a cardinal from Rome walked into Hagia Sophia and put a piece of parchment on the altar that no one had thought possible.